After this vision, the albatross falls from his neck. His transition is complete, and the mariner feels, he says, like a blessed ghost. So the poem records the mariner's spontaneous transformation into a kind of seer, whose vision has transcended that horizon of life and death. But he's also a very peculiar being as a result. He passes like night from land to land, with strange power of speech, feared and shrunk from as a something transnatural, in fact, but nevertheless with the power to fascinate, and through his story, through the poem itself, to initiate the process he describes, not only in the wedding guest of the poem whom he addresses, but we, the readers, whom the poem addresses. So the poem itself and its language assumes its own strange power of speech and becomes a transformative medium, kind of magic, if you will. Kubla Khan, perhaps the most highly condensed poem in the English language, is essentially a single poem comprised in stereoscopic form, I would say. The poet's initial vision of Xanadu, made fertile by Alph, the sacred river, whose source in the deep romantic chasm is haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover, is paralleled in the final stanza by his vision of the Abyssinian maid, singing of Mount Abora, whose symphony and song would allow him, once he has assumed the power of its music within himself, to recreate Xanadu in air, he says. I'm condensing heavily myself here, of course, but through the simple device of the pun in its name, Coleridge identifies the life-giving properties of the Alph with the power of language, the alphabet, and then maps these onto the world-creating music of the Abyssinian maid, in a composite image of the source of life and poetic song. By exposing and tuning himself to that source, which, the poem hints, might include eating and drinking sacred foods, the visionary is transfigured by a gnosis, in which he receives his knowledge in the form of a magically potent language. Like the mariner, his vision crosses the boundaries of ordinary consciousness, and he experiences that ecstasy as a social and religious transgression. I'll read out that final part. Could I revive within me her symphony and song, to such a deep delight would win me, that with music loud and long I would build that dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice, and all who heard should see them there, and all should cry, beware, beware, his flashing eyes, his floating hair, weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes in holy dread, for he on honeydew hath fed, and drunk the milk of paradise. In realizing its power, the poet sees what his own visionary gnosis of the sacred source of life and language makes him, at once exalted and alienated, a willing demon marked by shame and power. In Christabel, forgive me for skipping along so quickly, probably the last of the three mystery poems in order of conception, Coleridge's mythopoetic drama of demonic becoming takes another provocative turn. Here, the transnatural consummation assumes the explicit form of sexual union and the ambiguous iconography of the serpent. Now, the serpent, I should say, was far from being a stock image of evil for Coleridge. On the contrary, he used it as the symbolic nexus of language, knowledge, and power throughout his life. I'll give you a few examples. He uses it as an image of a writer of genius, an image of Shakespeare's language, an image of the principle of imagination, an image of poetic form and intellectual power, and of the Hebraic equivalent to the Promethean agency, which lured humanity to what he described as the nous, or divine principle in itself. More on that in a moment. My point here is that although Geraldine, the mysterious woman who emerges from the other side of the oak at midnight, who fascinates and seduces Christabel, although she's blended, as it were, with the figure of the serpent in the second part of the poem, this does not so much condemn her as further imbue her with the ambiguous glamour of the demonic. Following the pattern of the other mystery poems, the action revolves around a transfiguring gnosis, which rewrites Christabel's knowledge as it realises its occult form. Geraldine embodies both the gnosis and the power of its language. She is the transnatural form whose eroticised allure fascinates the sexual and experiential roots of Christabel's spirituality. And the entire poem centres upon the mystery of her encounter with Christabel. I'll read you the key moment, the moment which, having climbed into bed with the naked Christabel, Geraldine communicates her transnatural signature to Christabel with a spell and binds that knowledge within her. In the touch of this bosom there worketh a spell, which is Lord of thy utterance, Christabel. Thou knowest tonight and wilt know tomorrow this mark of my shame, this seal of my sorrow. But vainly thou warest, for this is alone in thy power to declare, that in the dim forest thou heardst a low moaning, and foundst a bright lady surpassingly fair. Christabel sees, experiences, and knows far more than the reader is told, explicitly at least. In her surrender to Geraldine, she exchanges normality for occult knowledge, if you will. She's initiated into what Coleridge would elsewhere call an intelligence blended with a darker power, deeper, mightier, and more universal than the conscious intellect of man. Geraldine's magical words do not merely affect Christabel's mind, they alter her entire being. And Coleridge reinforces this by dramatising her demonic consummation through sexual contact and its subsequent dream-filled sleep. Christabel's receptivity to Geraldine signals the depth of her receptivity to all that Geraldine represents. She experiences her otherworldly power in the most complete and palpable form of human intimacy. Christabel's fascination with and eroticised knowledge of Geraldine leads her to become what she has known in the pattern I've been describing. The obscure sense of shame in her new knowledge is made clear. She sleeps in Geraldine's arms, dreaming that alone which is, oh sorrow and shame. Coleridge breaks off, dreaming that alone which is, dash, oh sorrow and shame. Doesn't say. The next morning the sight of Geraldine stirs guilty feelings. Sure I have sinned, said Christabel, troubled with such perplexity of mind as dreams too lively leave behind. The power Christabel now possesses is less explicit because it consists in the knowledge of Geraldine herself, all that the lady who shadowy in the moonlight shone might symbolise. The shame of Christabel's experience consists in her separation from those who do not share her knowledge. They may be unfallen, but they're also ignorant of the ecstasy and the mystery of her experience. In one of the most famous lines of the poem, a sight to dream of, not to tell. Even though Coleridge returned to them throughout his life, the mystery poems originated over a relatively short period, 1797 and 98. But the demonic pattern I describe remained at the heart of Coleridge's most suggestive thinking, and my final example today reveals a later modulation of this pattern. In his lecture of 1825 on the Prometheus of Aeschylus, Coleridge conceives the divine quickening of humankind, the generation of the nous, he says, or reason, as a demonic event, and notably as a version of the fall myth, which in turn echoes that 1812 note on the demon and the mythopoesis of 1797 to 98. This vast lecture, which is more a treatise really, was the culmination of Coleridge's mythological syncretism. In short, he said, the sum of all my reading and reflection on this vast wheel of the mythology of the earliest and purest heathenism, in which he identified the Prometheus myth with the fall myth of Hebraic tradition. The Prometheus myth was, he wrote, the very same in aim and subject matter with the earliest myth of the Hebrews, which he thought was that of the forbidden fruit and the serpent. It's fascinating then in this context, Coleridge goes on to say that in the Prometheus myth, the characters of the rebellious spirit and of the divine friend of mankind, Theos Philanthropos, are united in the same person. The rebellious spirit and the divine friend of mankind are united in the same person. And he's saying this myth is the same as the Genesis 4 myth. Tellingly, Coleridge writes that the myth conceived the generation of the nous, or pure reason in man, as a seminal act of transgression, Prometheus' gift to humankind, his theft from the gods. Now Coleridge defined reason, the nous, as the organ of the supersensuous, the inward eye, which gives the sensuous understanding the power of acquainting itself with invisible realities, or spiritual objects. This, Coleridge says, is nothing less than the divine principle in man. So here we have Coleridge imagining the becoming of reason, the divine principle itself, as a revolutionary moment in which an act of transgression gives access to a transfiguring gnosis once more. The rebellious spirit is one and the same with the divine friend of mankind, who releases the divine potential of human becoming. The radical implication here for the Genesis myth is that Coleridge implicitly equates Prometheus, at once rebellious spirit and divine friend, with the serpent. And hence the promise of godlike knowledge in the fatal apple initiates a desirable fall in which the transgression of divine taboo brings gnosis, and by implication apotheosis. So in a sense we're back with Christabel and her eroticized gnosis of the serpent woman, Geraldine. Coleridge's philosophical and mythological syncretism leads back to his reading, aspirations and poetry of the later 1790s, in which the protagonist's willing exposure to the transnatural and the demonic imago it results in is first brought to poetic life. So in its dynamic tensions, the Coleridgean demon evokes fundamental dilemmas, I think, in the drama of human becoming itself. It is, as Coleridge said of the Prometheus myth, a figure of the conflicts of self-manifestation. And Coleridge's fascination with the genesis of new orders of power, knowledge and being, and his desire to realise their experiential origins in the imagination, is one of the things, I think, that give him permanent interest as a poet and a thinker, a writer capable of re-educating humankind from the inside out after any number of ideologies, religions and political orders have crumbled or even resurged. Thank you.